Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the scap and shoulder fixed training. In this training, we're going to be doing a little bit of whiteboard sessioning with you so that you understand the anatomy and the keys and the faults that you're going to run into when doing this kind of a work. Now, as I go through this, it's really important that if you haven't watched the actual fixed training video, what is fixed training, the functional integrated exercise training, make sure you go back and do that specifically first so that you understand what the methodology is, what the system is, so that ultimately you can be a little bit more myopic and dive into this stuff. So in this training, we're going to be working specifically on scapula and shoulder. When I say scapula, I mean scapula, like shoulder blade. You kind of know what that is. We're going to work on the anatomy, the faults, the keys, and some fails that people fall into when they're doing this kind of a thing so that you can have the most success out there. I'm giving you multiple thumbs up just for you. Let's get after it. All right. So let's work on the anatomy. I'm going to grab my buddy Barry Bones here. So Barry and I, we've been all over the place together. He and I, we've traveled the world. He's come with me from California. I guess I just went from California to Texas, so here we are, just in Texas, me and Barry. So let's work on anatomy of the scapula itself. So a couple key factors of the anatomy is that the anatomy of the scapula, it's actually not a bony joint, meaning it actually sits on soft tissue that is attached to the rib cage, so the upper back and neck region. So anytime I'm working on scapula or shoulder, somebody comes into my office and says, hey, I got this shoulder issue, I always tell them, start with your upper back. So if you haven't done the upper back work, make sure you go back and actually do that first, so that your upper back has a good positioning, that it is really the keystone, it's the foundation for what's going on here. I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but if I'm in poor position and I'm rotated forward, well, my upper back, my scapula is going to have to follow, and now my scapula is going to be out of position, and now this little glenohumeral joint, which is what we consider the shoulder, is also going to be out of position, and now I'm going to have issues in my rotator cuff, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this is, again, related to itself. So if you notice that on the scapula itself, there's this little it's called the spinous, spinous process. This is the spine of the scapula, this little ridge, and then this comes together. You got your AC joint and your SC joint in the front. It also connects to, this is your clavicle. So when I say your scap, I also associate that with this. I'm really looking at what's going on in all these articulations. A lot of people have AC, ruptures. They'll have glenohumeral dislocations. So these are all common faults that we see with your scapula. Now, again, anytime I'm working on this stuff, I'm really focusing on what's going on in your upper back, and is there rotation of your upper back. So are you rotated, or is one of your shoulders high for whatever reason? And that could be because you've been playing too much baseball or hitting a volleyball too much, or you've been like a one-sided athlete, or just sitting at a desk all day. That could be it as well. So if you sit for 8 hours a day, consider this. If you worked out your biceps, it's kind of on and off for like 8 hours a day, like your biceps would be massive. Of course they would. Well, the same thing is true for your upper back. If you're training it to be this, if you're sitting at a desk and you're not training it to go the other way, well, now all of a sudden your muscles are going to be trained and your ligaments are going to be trained to be there. So going the other way is going to take some time and some work. You can't just pull yourself back and hope for the best. So that's super important. All right, let me put Barry down here, and then I'll show you a little bit more about anatomy. Another thing I want to kind of mention, this is your scapula, another model of your scapula. So this would be your right side. So if you kind of sit back here like this, is that you have all these muscles and these articulations. So this is what's considered your rotator cuff. So your rotator cuff, and when I say cuff, C-U-F-F, not cup, a lot of times, even I thought it was cup. I thought it was rotator cuff for the longest time. Super common. Don't worry about it. It's cuff. It's basically what it is. They call it a cuff, but it's more like this kind of sucky mechanism. It's these muscles that stabilize your glenohumeral joint for motion, and really where motion comes from, if I want to translate force through my shoulder, I want this rotator cuff to be stable. So even though it's called a rotator cuff, that doesn't really rotate. It kind of just more sucks it in there. So you like sucks your glenohumeral joint and your humerus into your glenohumeral joint so that it doesn't have a lot of kind of sway. It creates more stability in there. So let's kind of talk about common fails that we see oftentimes in your scap and shoulder. The biggest thing that I want to talk about that isn't really considered in just scap and shoulder is that your thoracic spine or your upper back has to be mobile. So if you've done the upper back work, you kind of heard me just preaching on that. I need the upper back to be mobile. You got to have it mobile, because if that thing isn't mobile, well, now your scapula can't be stable. So if I don't have a stable scapula, right? So if my scap is not stable, now my glenohumeral joint, which is like the ball and socket joint of the scapula and shoulder, can't do the job that it needs to do in order to get the rotation. So it's actually like, it's a stable mobility is the best way to describe it. So my glenohumeral joint here is sort of a combination of mobile with stability. Now, every joint, and you could argue every joint has mobility, every joint has stability. Absolutely, I totally agree. But what we really want is we want our scapula to be stable, but we need our thoracic spine to be mobile. We need to get mobility and position in our thoracic spine, our rib cage, so then my scapula can sit properly on my rib cage, and now my glenohumeral joint can do the work of translating force if I'm going to throw a ball, if I'm going to land a punch, if I'm just going to be a human and be out here in front of my body and work in front of me, like let's say I'm just woodworking, doesn't matter what it is, I need both mobility and stability. So if I don't have mobility, stability in my glenohumeral joint, that's when you're going to start to get that tearing. That's when you're going to start to get a rotator cuff rupture. And I was actually working with a lady. She was in her 50s. She was not an old lady at the time. You know, you can consider 50 old, depends on how old you are, right? She had very poor posture, and she was saying she went to go unbuckle her bra strap, and boom, she popped her rotator cuff. Well, why? Because she didn't have T-spine mobility. She didn't have that thoracic spine mobility where she could be in a good position, and then that rotator cuff could do the work that it needed to, which is offload the muscle. The muscle was so tight, fascia started building and building and building and building, and then that's when she popped her rotator cuff. And so, you know, then she's giving me the big woe story, woe is me, and now she's got to go to the orthopedic doctor and get it repaired and all this. And again, don't be a victim. Do the work necessary. That's why you're here. I know it. You are taking personal responsibility. I love it. All right, so let's talk about keys. Going into the keys of scapula and shoulder. We're talking about thoracic spine so much that it's such an integral part. It is. I mean, let's talk about that. Thoracic spine mobility is an absolute key. I need to have that thoracic spine mobility. That is super key. In fact, that's probably the number one key to scapula and shoulder health. Now, like, consider that. Like, the number one thing that causes health in your scapula and shoulder is actually not the scap and shoulder. It's somewhere else. Absolutely. Because your thoracic spine, your rib cage, your upper back, is the position which it sits on. And so if that's not sitting correctly, if you have poor posture, now, again, it's in a poor position, and that's when it's going to create more adhesions, more tearing, more breakdown, more dysfunction, and that's when we get into poor position. So what I need to do is I need to improve my posture. So that is an absolute key. So make sure posture is on point. And what is good posture? Again, I want to have my shoulder, my ear, my shoulder, my hips, my feet in alignment as I'm standing from the side, from the front. I don't want to be rotated. I want to have a high shoulder. I don't want to be rotated this way either. I want to have good posture side to side as well. So we've got to consider those things. All right, the last key here is when I'm working on my glenohumeral joint is I should say this, scapula needs to be stable. I gotta backtrack for you. Scapular stability, and my glenohumeral joint needs to be both mobile and stable. And you're probably thinking, like, what do you mean stable? Well, I just mean that my rotator cuff has to be able to do its job, which is creating that suction cupping effect. I don't need to rotate. A lot of times where people fail is that they look at glenohumeral as rotator. When they hear the word rotator, they think, yes, that's what I'm doing. Well, when I'm re-educating, yeah, I'm going to do maybe a little bit of rotation and then just turn those muscles on. But when I'm actually really stabilizing this thing, when I'm actually working it, when I'm strengthening it, I'm actually not rotating it. I'm actually holding it in position, things like farmer walk and waiter walk and making sure that you're in a strong, stable position. We're going to do things that are, I call them scap dancers, where you're going to hold onto a band and you're going to be in a strong, stable position while doing that work. I really want to put that rotator cuff in just a simple, stable position and then train it to make sure it's doing its job. One quick key to this as well, and a lot of people don't talk about this, is that when you grab onto something, a handle, a pull-up bar, a barbell, of anything, a kettlebell, when you grab onto the entire handle and you squeeze, what happens is that your rotator cuff actually starts to get that effect. So it actually stimulates your rotator cuff to do the work necessary to stabilize. So anytime I'm working on strength, especially for a scapula, is I don't want to see, when you're doing that, I don't want to see the monkey grip where your thumb is over the top of the bar. Or you're going to be, like if you're picking up, like doing a bench press, a lot of times people do the monkey grip, or they're doing a pull-up, they're doing a monkey grip. I actually want you to get your thumb underneath, and I want you to hold on. I want you to create grip strength through your forearm so that your scapula can be in a good, proper position. That's super important. So anytime you're doing, that's again, a key is that grip. I'm going to write that down. Grip is super important. That's an absolute key. So common fails that I see, number one, is that people don't work on T-spine. I'm going to harp on it over and over and over again. T-spine, upper back, that's what that is. Got to make sure you're mobilizing your thoracic spine. A lot of times people are not stabilizing their scapula. So there's no scapular stability. And what I mean by that is they're going to try to do the rotations like a lot of, you go to PT or whatever, like all the common thought right now is like, oh, if I just do these banded exercises, then I'm good. Well, no, that's not the case. I actually need your scapula to be attached into your rib cage, which then attaches into your opposite hip, so that when you're walking or running or doing anything, that thing is stable. So if you want to have healthy shoulders, have thoracic mobility, and have stable scapulas. And then the last thing that people aren't doing is that they're actually not both mobilizing and stabilizing glenohumeral joints. So I'm going to bring this down here. So that is a common fail, both mobility and stability. Again, for the same common reason, I need that glenohumeral joint, which is a tiny ball and socket. So imagine like I have like a golf ball on this, or it's like a golf ball on a tee. That's about the same concept, is that I have a golf ball on here, and that's about it. And then I have the articulation of my rotator cuff around it. Whereas if I was going to be working on my hip, in this context, my hip, I'm going to put this down really quick, is like it fully encompasses the whole bony structure, fully encompasses that joint. So that's why your hip is so much more stable already, whereas your shoulder is a lot more mobile. So you actually do want to create stability in your glenohumeral joint. Even though it is a mobile joint relative to the scapula, I do need to have stability in there. So that's a common fail. So again, keys. I'm going to go back, I'm going to harp on it. Thoracic spine mobility. Work on that first. If you haven't already done that work, then go back. Stop what you're doing. Don't pass go. Go back to the thoracic mobility. Make sure your posture is good there. Then you can create scapular stability. Then you can create glenohumeral joint mobility stability. Now, a lot of people ask the question, a quick caveat about this. When I have an AC separation, meaning the ligaments in my AC joint have popped, meaning a grade 3 separation, will that ever come back? And the answer is no. You'll never be able to get your clavicle to come back down into your scapula. It's just the way it is. Now it's an aesthetic thing, but the functioning can still be there. I would still train that individual the exact same. So if you're working with an AC separation, I would still train you the exact same way. I would still work you through the exact same process, but just know aesthetically that will never come back because that ligament is separated. And then the question is, should I go get it surgically repaired? You don't necessarily have to. I would totally consult with an orthopedist if you want to, but it's not always necessary. And then the last thing is, if you had a glenohumeral dislocation, I would train you the exact same. In fact, I would train you T-spine mobility and then scapular stability right away. I mean, that's really what you need. Your whole rotator cuff has been torn up, and we need to get that thing back in there, stabilize it. You really need to start training some rotator cuff stability, not rotator cuff mobility. So keep that in mind. So start with stability, re-education, working on that stuff. All right, So this has been scap and shoulder, the whole thing. I've gone through all the things, the anatomy, the faults, the keys, and the fails. If you're watching this in the program, then go to phase 1, which would be mobility and re-education. If you're watching this from the YouTube world, then by all means, click on the description below. You have access to purchase this program so that you can actually go through this as well. So click on the link below so that you can get access. Like I said, if you are wondering, I got pain, what do I do? What do I do if I have pain? We'll start with phase 0, which is getting out of pain. And I'm gonna have a bunch of videos in here. Maybe I'll link them underneath as well. But just know that get out of pain first. If you're coming off of a surgery, just know that you're gonna start with phase 1 for a longer period of time. So I might have you on phase 1, like you did just have a rotator cuff surgery. I would have you on phase 1 for a little bit longer, so just keep that in mind. And then once you do that, once you go through that process, then you can go into phase 1. So that'd be like, phase 2, then phase 3. So you start with phase 1, mobility, re-education, then you can go into phase 2, phase 3, etc. All right, guys. This has been an awesome training. I really appreciate you watching. If you like this, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe. I appreciate you guys. I'll see you in the next training, and stay unbreakable.